wonder if you could kick us off, Paul. I was thinking about how painting is being seen a lot in commercial spaces, especially in London, most obviously. And I was wondering how that translates to the public sector. And do you think the public sector should show more painting, or do you think it fulfills that remit?
So are people here mostly artists, or can I just say a quick show of hands? Most people are. Most of you are artists. Yeah, great. I think. I feel that I see a lot of shows in London, and I see a lot of commercial gallery shows in London, and I think that there are lots of paintings in London, and a cynical part of me thinks that the art market is really influential in practice, increasingly so, problematically so, in that painting sells very well, sort of moves around the world very easily, it's easy to store, it sort of conforms to an idea of art, for most people. So I think there's also a fatigue sometimes with the very bewildering forms of art that have come out of more conceptual art practices like installation art or sound art or all sorts of things that I think people don't always find so enjoyable aesthetically, and so I think there are all sorts. I think all of that generates a mix of different kinds of approach to painting. But I'm interested in the distinction that you make actually between the public sort of institutional spaces and the market spaces, because I think inevitably with public funding going down, a lot of institutions find that their programs are being very infused by and sort of have a close relationship with the commercial gallery sector. And I certainly look around institutions in the UK and I can see that some institutions are working very closely with commercial galleries in London, and combined with that, there is a sense. I know when we talk about doing exhibitions at Modern Art Oxford, we'll very often say, we should do a painting show. People like painting, and so we see it as a very accessible way in for most audiences. So that's not to say that we're seeing more painting necessarily in institutions, regardless, because I think that there is still an interest in other forms of practices that look like they're more radically new, that are maybe coming out of digital cultures, and of course there's lots of painting that is responding to that digital cultures. But I think that I think there is this very exciting re-energizing of painting for lots of different reasons. And I think you do see that in institutions because it's seen as an easy route in for audiences. Right. This is the question.
Yeah, I mean, continuing that, I would say that the institutional aspects of the art world are maybe not as committal to painting as they are in Europe. I don't know if you'd agree. I think, for example, in Germany, there seems to be quite a strong commitment to painting and possibilities for painting, which you seem to don't see in the UK, but maybe.
Should I take that? I think it can be difficult to compare the UK that has got quite centralised markets and centres for artistic production with Europe, where there's a very decentralised sort of system in France and in Germany. You have kind of every kind of town will have like it's Kunsthalle or it's Kunstverein, and there's a local bourgeoisie that supports that kind of. It's a slightly different setup, and I think like in all cultures, and I'm going to describe this very clunkily because I think it's a really complex set or a matrix of influences. But I think that in countries like Germany, and of course Germany's had this long-standing commitment to painting, to produce some of the most important paintings in the modern and contemporary period. But again, they're very present within and very influential, I think, within the market. I think if you looked at the most expensive painters around, they're mostly German and they're certainly male, and they are very expensive artists with blue chip galleries. So, and of course they're coming out of a strong history of avant-garde modernist movements that was primarily in Europe and not in the UK. I'm comparing relative scales. So I think there are a number of factors there. I used to work at the Contemporary Art Society, so I would be skinned for saying this, but I think that there was a kind of an early modernity and a modernism, obviously, in British art, but it didn't seem to have the same kind of radicality around it, I think, as that you find in the European avant-garde movements. And its same relationship to political and social situations. So it's a massive generalisation, and many of you could say, "Oh, hold on a bit," but I'm just for the purpose of making a broad situational argument. I think our culture is quite different actually from Europe. Dare I say that? As a passionate Remainer, I'm such a Remainer. Please don't think that I'm a Brexiteer at all. I'm sorry to lower the tone by talking about Brexit. So I think they're very different situations, but I agree that on the continent there's a great vitality and commitment around painting. And in fact, we were talking about the sort of I see a lot of very neo-expressionist painting, I think. Certainly looking at Jan's work, I see lots of relationships with certain strains of Germanic, kind of, the Emil Nolders and the Neo-Rauchs and artists like that and bits of Bacon actually in some of your spaces. Anyway, I'll put the British artists in there. Or an Irish artist, I should say.
I think that's really interesting, and I think it sort of leads on to also my observation of teaching particularly in Germany, which I know about because my cousin is an artist there, and how the German art schools and produce painters. I think that's another contribution to particularly the German painting schools and Eastern Europe as well. They have a sort of completely different system here where they really train their artists, their painters or their sculptors in a school where there is a maestro painter and you sign up for that for God knows how many years and you really learn your craft. And that is something that I think is possibly missing in a lot of the time in the European in the British education system. And I mean that might lead on to a question to Alison, for instance. That could be interesting. And Juan, both Juan and Alison teach as well as other things, but interestingly here, Alison has set up really a private school, independent, private is the word, is it? Independent painting school, and Juan teaches at Wimbledon. So this is Camberwell, sorry?
Never forgive me.
Oh no. Camberwell. So perhaps a question for both of you would be, how is painting taught these days, and why, and how, and does it still? I mean, I know in some universities, it's less. There was a point at which there was a feeling that painting was dead, and there was nobody to teach it anymore. So, yes, please.
Well, perhaps first of all I should explain that I trained and taught at Glasgow School of Art, which is slightly different from the English art schools. Is that? I hear. So that model you described in Germany, I'm more familiar with. And Glasgow School of Art was actually, its painting department has been very successful in producing lots of interesting contemporary painters. Jenny Sappho, Alison Harper, and also before, just pre that, Adrian Wisniewski, Stephen Campbell, Peter Hausen, been not to put in that category, and then latterly more as well. But we actually, in Glasgow School of Art, I trained in the 80s, and we had a very rigorous combination of training and craft. So we'd have, for example, in second year, it's a 4-year course, you had 3 weeks of live painting, and then 3 weeks of personal projects. So you had the combination of the sort of rigour, the craft, and 3 weeks of life painting the same pose is kind of hell. It's so difficult, but that combination I felt actually really worked because you had to do so much looking, so it basically sort of rerouted you from a sort of critical thinking to really looking and sort of trying to solve a visual problem by visual means. And so you'd go and look up painters. So a whole treatise on painting, a text, isn't necessarily going to help you, but looking at how other painters had actually solved those problems visually really did. So you get people piling into the life room with loads of books. And the great thing about Glasgow, I think, was that the tutors, there wasn't a house style, unlike, dare I say, at Edinburgh. Some great painters come from Edinburgh too. But because the tutors weren't going around saying, do it this way, do it this way, do it this way, they'd say, what are you trying to do? So you had the combination of the rigour and the looking with trying to solve these visual problems, looking at artists that you liked, you felt drawn to. So there's a sort of practical route through, and a sense of then being an emotional connection through the act of painting as well. So people would choose their different palettes, but they're also actually having the discipline of looking what's there and how do I translate that. And then you'd have 3 weeks of a project that might be set up with a theme, which would be more conceptual, sort of like openings or some kind of conceptual theme. And so you had the combination of the two. So I thought that worked really well in terms of the. So anyway, back to what we're doing now. So we set up the Essential School of Painting in London 14 years ago. So I was teaching in Glasgow, I was commuting from London to Glasgow, it's too much. And what we were finding is people down here in London were saying, I've been to art school. In those days you still saw a tutor fairly regularly. But now that's another issue you might, that we're dealing with. And there wasn't really, the life room is a dirty word for a start. So we were finding in Glasgow, when I was still teaching there, we were having droves of people coming up from England saying, I really want to paint. Oh dear, it's my dirty little secret, I want to paint. And the life room sounds quite interesting. I'd really like to do that. And unfortunately, the time I left, it was about 2000, left Glasgow, we had all these goldsmiths tutors come up. We were trying to ban the life room. And so it started to change at Glasgow as well. So anyway, in the Essential School of Painting, we're trying to keep that engagement with contemporary art, contemporary discourse, critical theory, dare I say it, but a respect for the craft, as you describe it, of painting. So we'll have a portrait class, for example, but we're not going to have formulas, but we'll ask people, what are you trying to do? But really look. And you're finding visual routes to solve a visual problem, and you're immersed in that visual world. And painting is a language. It's a reality. It's like standing in nature, in a wordless realm, allowing nature to touch you. And there's only so far, I think, words can take you. They can take you very, very far. But the act of painting is something slightly different. And so my argument would be that I think the art schools have gone very, very too far in a sense of a reliance on the critical theory to replace that act of looking and problem solving visually. So that's I don't know if you want to answer that now. As somebody who teaches in the mainstream art schools.
Wow. I think one of the interesting things about discussing painting, I mean, I will answer your question, education in a moment, but one of the things about discussing painting is that it's a little bit like, I've been thinking, it's a little bit like, discussing God, in that everybody, has a very specific and different definition. So in the same way that everybody will have a very different idea of what God might be, whenever we talk about painting, we assume that we're talking about the same thing, but I suspect that we're actually talking about quite different things, and I sometimes hear things which, in a sense, make me realise that how different another practice might be to mine, or another way of thinking. And one of the things which I think is very specific to painting, and I guess the teaching of painting, if you can call that, at Camberwell, where I'm based, is that we try to see paint beyond its medium specificity. So we're thinking about painting as a dialogue, as a sort of greater dialogue that you have within the subject. And but at the same time, if you want to explore a relationship to materials, or to the idea of traditional materials or practices, you can do. But if you want to look at, say, the idea of the tableau, and make something using video, for example, you're not going to get thrown out of the painting department. Whereas you sometimes in other departments you hear this very kind of quite militant. You either get a very militant view of like painting is oil on canvas, or from when I studied at Goldsmiths, years later that painting was forbidden. So you get this extreme opposite ends. On the one hand, at St Martin's in the 18th, painting was a very, very narrow definition, I think, in that it had to be 6 foot square, made red in spectrum paint, and you had to be covered in the paint. And then in Goldsmiths, you had to present a proposal with a legal document, and it would be considered by the department whether you would be allowed to make a painting. And in a sense, then the conversation, and it's interesting seeing the show and the mixture of, I guess, approaches and discussions around the idea of painting makes me realise that we all have a very different view of painting. So the question was education, something to do with education. What was the question about education?
I think we started with Paul's sort of description of where painting is kind of today in the UK, and that led us on to thinking about different countries and how the German system might produce a different type of painter. But then we sort of got to where we are kind of today. Are we training young painters to be painters? But you're saying painting is so broad that you can't really... Yeah,
that's it. It's incredibly, the range of practices that take place today, or that we see coming through at Camberwell, incredibly broad. I mean, you get similar personality types. I think that's interesting. You get the person who is never there, and then you get the person who is manically, making paintings with oil sticks and 6-inch brush. Then you get the person who brings in a car bonnet, or a bath or a fridge, so you get different personality types every year. They seem to reoccur. But in terms of, I think the idea of a kind of idea of what painting is, I don't think it's as prescriptive of saying, maybe the German system where you have a master or something. I think they'd sort of look the other way if we suggested that.
Do you think there's any kind of current sort of modes or fashions for a certain kind of way of working that the students are picking up on?
I think without lowering the tone, I think the biggest influence at the moment to a lot of students, and this might come as a shock, and it's the biggest problem that I have actually. So the biggest influence to the students is Instagram. So you can say we're going to have we're getting Barnett Newman and Peter Halley and Hal Foster. They're going to do a talk, and that will that sort of go over the heads. But if you mention that, or if they say to you that somebody has 20,000 followers on Instagram, that will mean something to them. And the problem with, I love Instagram, but at the same time, the problem with it is that it's fracturing the context of discussion more than anything. So once upon a time you had a library, or you had, for example, certain places where you went to see work. You'd go to sort of, Tate, before it became Tate Modern. You'd go to the Hayward, you go to the Serpentine, you go to Watch. So you would go and find work in certain contexts, so whether it was the library or a place. And I think what's very peculiar now is the way in which you have cat paintings next to maybe a picture from this exhibition and something else, and it creates this kind of like very it's almost like it's a problem with the democracy. it creates this very even spread of things, which, that's the biggest influence at the moment. Secondly to that, I think the biggest influence is that they kind of feel much more than I think I did when I was studying years ago. They feel a kind of a greater anxiety of what's going on in the world at large, and I think they find difficult to reconcile how to make a painting that addresses those things, precisely because you're being subjected to so many images and etc. etc. Whereas when I studied at St Martin's, there was a sense that you could go and, for example, protest or make a painting or something, and it would have a difference. And I think there's an anxiety that's emerging with students today to do with how to deal with the world through painting.
Do you think? I was just going to say on that point that do you think that's to do? I mean, I remember from my own personal experience being at Goldsmiths in the late 90s, sort of pre the internet, and going to find. I mean, I remember having a tutorial with a tutor, and he was going, you should look at this guy Gerhard Richter. And I'd never heard of him. I'd never even heard of Gerhard Richter, and they had one book in the library, and it was, like a really a black and white book on Richter of about 20 pages or something. So I think that idea of maybe seeking out things, that seeking out of images and information about artists is something that feels very different now, and it's I understand the anxiety I think that students must face. I don't know if whether it's to do with that idea that there's just so much to choose from. I don't know. There's so many possible variations, and maybe do you think there's also an emphasis to show work very early on?
Well, I'll answer the first question first, and which is to do with images. You're talking about images, and I think there's two cases where, paradoxically, the scarcity of an image has made it more popular. And the first one is that I think of is when the Mona Lisa was stolen, and people actually went to see the empty space, where the Mona Lisa stood, and they sold postcards, and that's where tradition of postcards often is quoted to come from. And the other example that I think of is the last Futurist exhibition, that very famous image of the Malevich, Black Square, and other paintings. And there were only 2 pictures of that exhibition taken in 1915, and it's incredibly iconic partly through the fact that it's such a rare image. And so I think there's a weird correlation between our attachment to images through this. It's like when people used to have a picture of their parents or kids in their wallet, and it would become incredibly significant. And now it's difficult to have that emotional connection to images, I think. And then the other question, or the other point you were making, was about exhibiting. I don't think there's a pressure for students to exhibit early on, but we do try and prepare them somehow professionally. They're far more organised than I ever was, and we do try and encourage them to just be somehow ready and able to, if somebody asks for their CV or images, but we don't pressurise them as such to exhibit. But there again, without sort of going back to Instagram and sort of having a go, that's become also their major forum for them often to, it's like a visual diary that everybody can sort of follow, or it's quite good to find out what they're up to, sort of when they say I'm in the library and then you realise that they've gone on holiday or something. It's quite good to spying on there. But the thing about education is that it's I don't know. I mean, I was looking at this question here: the relationship between painting, the art world, and education. One of the questions here, and it was just making me think about the way in which there's such different entities. They're almost completely separate to each other, but connected somehow. And I was thinking about an analogy of, painting being like, the school of Athens, and this idea of like platonic love, this kind of like idyllic sort of concept, and then education becomes more like sort of romantic love, and often you get people coming to art school because they love the romance of being at an art school, and we try and remind them of like this idea of that there's also the school of Athens and platonic love. But then the art world, I was thinking, it's a bit more like sort of speed dating, and you kind of get a lot of kind of conversations then reduced to much shorter sound bites that in some ways, you have this very long and meaningful conversations and crits art education, and then, especially with commercial galleries, they'll say, the red one or the blue one, or, the one with a funny smile or something, and everything gets reduced to this sort of little sound bite. And I think that's one of the things that we have to negotiate. I'm not sort of like trying to put it down, but I think it's just one of the things that we always negotiate in those three worlds, in a sense.
And I just want to, I think we all know that we're living in these really interesting, quite extraordinary times. I mean, like technology, and then just the kind of world politically that we're in. And I think part of what's generating so many sets of opportunities for painting is that it is that space that artists often go to try to create a relationship to the world, and be that picking up the new for, an interest in the new surfaces of digital culture in the 21st century, things that look like tablets, or this kind of super flatness, or certain kind of spatial compositions that look like, window environments, or, so I think there's all of that, and I think that the kind of activism that we're seeing in practice, which of course is taking really radical directions, I think, in different types of practices, which we wouldn't necessarily call artistic practices, like the research, architecture, methodologies that are at Goldsmiths, for example, at the moment. But painting still continues to be a place where things can be critiqued most readily, and I think that makes it really very generative. Because it's got that history, it's got its conventional tropes, it's got its sort of symbolism, and I know that makes it really hard. I'm not obviously a painter, but for those of you that are, I think the burden of painting, the legacy of painting, saying something new is really challenging. So, but I think because we live in this really generative moment, I think painting's become a space that people return to in an essential way. Just to create a relationship to this radically changing world. And of course there are all these other people that are doing very different things. They're working digitally, or they're doing installations as well. None of this is stopping, but I think there has been a resurgence in painting as an opportunity to try to take stock of what's happening in the world today. So.
I would just think that's true. I think painting does inhabit its own sort of reality in a sense, as an experience, and it's just quite sensual. So I think often what can be quite frustrating, I think, as painters, is when it's approached very intellectually, and people are trying to. I'm not saying yourself, because what we're finding again and again at Central Painting is people are coming to us having just done a BA, for example, in fine art, and saying, I just want to paint. And it seems like something that they really feel very, very strongly drawn to. And, I think that many people will struggle still and want to engage with very current political content or subject matter. But it's the physical act of painting seems to be almost, dare I say it without sounding quite romantic. Well, I am romantic, actually. Quite primordial, and it's this. I think it probably predates literacy and numeracy, making marks, and there's some real pleasure in that you see in children doing, and it's that sense of people. It's almost like a relief from that anxiety, that intellectual anxiety that I find. I mean, dare I say it? Sometimes we call ourselves a rehabilitation centre for fine art graduates. I can get really controversial here. And because there's such, and especially for young people who are quite vulnerable in a sense of for being able to stand up for what they be able to listen to their intuition and what they feel like doing, because in the face of these really strong arguments and really potent intellectual discussions. I mean, I've one of our, well, I don't want to be able to identify them, but a very prominent painter in the art world in London has said to me that he's fed up being in discussions and feeling stupid. And he's a very good painter and very recognised, and he's gone through the critical theory, and he still can sit in discussions and feel like he doesn't understand and he's stupid. So if he feels like that, I think that a lot of students are feeling like that too, and there's no disrespect to all these wonderful tutors who are doing amazing work in art schools, and I really have great respect, and I've been there myself, taught in Glasgow for many years, but I do think there's something failing our students, and they're coming out saying, I feel more confused. There's something about the act of making which relieves us from an intellectual anxiety. It roots us in the present and makes us deal with this language that's making the substance that's not of an abstract thought, that does something different for us and it's a relief in a sense, and that ideas can be expressed through that. I mean, I'm being controversial, I'm aware of interpreting your knuckle cracking or something, but it's that there's something that we're feeling. There's a balance that's wrong, I find, generally, because we've been, it was so many students, fine art graduates and postgraduate students coming to us saying that I just want to make, and I want to be relieved of that, but still make something meaningful, but be in that moment of making and producing and pushing colour around where I'm not questioning every move I make, and able to have that immersive moment, like, as I said, I mentioned before, standing in nature, and when we may be standing in nature, feeling the wind in our face, and maybe not critiquing that experience. So I just, it doesn't quite follow on from what you were saying, I suppose, but I just throwing that in there.
I think that's really interesting, and as a painter I completely relate to that. It's such a visceral activity, and it's one that one can do without, you can do it wherever you are. I'm always a painter wherever I am, and I don't have to even have, the possibility to put on a big installation in a gallery. I can still be a painter, because every day I can go to my studio, or I can paint on my knee, or I can see things, and I still feel I'm a painter, and I often make sculptures and video and stuff, and I'm still a painter. So it's a wonderful privilege, I think, to feel that you can just make something and immerse yourself in that process of making. I think that, for instance, in this exhibition, there's very little words. I mean, there aren't we haven't even put the titles there, but we also haven't got a massive text box or something. And I was just here just the other day, just kind of looking at who was looking. I quite like watching people, audience. I go to galleries and I watch the people, and I think what I notice is that people will really draw the colour, will bring them in, and they'll look at that, and there's a kind of sense of excitement that they don't have to go to a text box to understand what it is. They can go along and just make of it. And the sort of conversations that happen with sort of more narrative expressionist painting, I think I find that very rewarding, that anybody who's passing by will be drawn into it, and they don't need to have any background knowledge or explanation. You look like you want to say
without well, I was going to say I guess I was going to say that I disagree, basically. I was going to say that I completely disagree. I think that we take for granted that I think painting and visual arts is a culturally embedded activity, and that the context of the discussion is in a sense as important as the materials or the pleasure derived from making a painting, etc. And an example of that is, for example, is the way in which Malevich, he's painting happily. He's painting squares for rectangles for a few years, but then there's a political change in and Stalin decides that this is not appropriate, and then suddenly these squares take a different significance. You know, they're not just neutral shapes. They're not just universal portals. They become symbols for threats to their ideology. And he's incarcerated for 6 months and forbidden. You know, he cannot paint any more squares. So when he comes out of he sort of prison, he tries to adapt his style. He tries to do figurative paintings, which look quite geometric, as if he's trying to still beat the system. And then eventually he ends his career making this quite sad sort of representational paintings that, you know, he signs with a tiny little square, as if he's. So I think that for me, that tiny little square that he's signing the paintings with symbolizes the fact that, you know, the visual language that we use has a very culturally embedded significance, and I think that, you know, I personally I find it strange that there's a conflict between theory and practice, because the two for me are like you know, completely, you know, interrelated. So I just like to say.
I would agree, actually, completely interrelated, and I think that critical theory can be really helpful, and there's a sense that when it's used as a function to open the mind and to make you question and be intrigued and excited, it's absolutely crucial. And context, in a sense, context is almost everything. I mean, Rembrandt said atmosphere is everything. You could say context is everything, absolutely. I think my point I'm trying to make is that I think the balance is wrong for many people, especially young people, and I think it's also in combination with the fact that when, especially young people, because I think more mature people have got a little more wherewithal to deal with the problems of being at art school, is that many students are left with their own devices for long periods. They're not given very much guidance, and they may be getting one-to-one tutorial once a term. I think you said Wimbledon's not quite like that. That's Camberwell. Sorry. Which is great, and I think the problem is that in combination with going straight into a B, and many people are also doing a foundation now to save cost. So I've got students who are wanting to get into art school, they need to do a foundation, going straight into BA. They're being accepted because art schools are desperate for students, so they haven't got basic skills foundation, and they're being left for long periods by themselves. They might get one seminar a week, and they get a one-to-one tutorial once a term. So that combination with a huge emphasis on critical theory, they're not just grounding themselves in the moment, just drawing something. I think there's a problem in the balance, and I think ultimately being a good artist is about having depth, and a critical theory can lead you to a place where you're questioning, and you have more depth, you're going to be a better artist, absolutely. And I think it's really fascinating. One of the examples I use is Michael Landy, after he did his big piece, is it called Breakup? Where he Breakdown, yeah. He did this fantastic piece where he got everything he ever owned, apart from the clothes he was standing up in, and put it in a grinder or something, so he destroyed it all. And then even some dealers, I think, were quite annoyed with him because he had some great work. Tracy Evans did Damien Hirst, anyway, some quite valuable work. And then it was a sort of like renunciation, like a monk, in a sense. It was quite a powerful gesture. And then what he did was he did a series of line drawings of weeds in London. And I thought that was such a beautiful, poetic combination of the two. And there's something about that balance of making and thinking and being opened up that isn't quite right at the moment. And a lot of art schools will say that students aren't receiving more contact time with tutors because they're trying to make them more independent, and they have words like self-negotiated learning, and actually the students are confused and lonely, and so coming up with spurious ideas that aren't really coming from them. It's not an example of them opening up, it's an example of them trying to be noticed. And so it's not coming from good places, really, the places you want it to come from when you're genuinely being opened up. And so, but it's a cost-cutting exercise, that's the problem. So it's not getting all political. So self-negotiated learning is one thing, and cost-cutting is another.
Well, that's really interesting. Are there any students here that would like to comment on that?
No comments.
No comment. Okay. I know your tutor's sitting right in front of you there. Paul will shut his ears for a moment. You can say what you like. That's that Paul there. That's the tutor Brooks. No?
I think I'd have to agree with the lack of time that is spent with a tutor and the kind of loneliness and anxiety that you feel as a student trying to produce the work that will get you the best marks and that will get you into the real world when you're kind of just left by yourself without any guidance. It can get really difficult.
Thank you. Yeah, and another one, yes?
I disagree with her.
Okay.
No, sorry. But because I find that letting us have more personal time actually simulates how it is in the real world.
But that's not what a degree is about. You know, it's about learning and exploring and having guidance. When you're in the real world, completely different story, but you know, when you're there paying to be there to learn, you have certain expectations that aren't necessarily being met at the moment.
Interesting. Okay, a little quick student survey there.
This is an aside really, because really people need to be understanding how to become an artist when they're doing their degrees and the beginning of that and the tricky phase then when they leave and they lose all of that support and that community of interest. But the thing that I get really frustrated about is that there's also artists and producers, they have no understanding at all about the art world. So they come out into a system where they don't really know how to, if they want to have a gallery or how that works or how to kind of, they don't know the first thing really at all. I mean, they come out completely ill-equipped to sustain their practice. And I think that, and I've yet to see a course that addresses that. And I know that it's not necessarily the priority, certainly in a very sparse tutorial system. But I think it's really the number of talks that I've given to artists, like about how to sustain their practice, how to find that support, how to get grants, or what residencies are, or actually how the art world filters you through, like subscription and all of these sorts of things. So I know these things are very procedural, but it is the difference between the few people that are now choosing to do fine art, continuing to be artists, or deciding to give up and do something else, which, for those of us that run institutions that are really reliant on that pipeline of talent, it's a grave concern, as are many of the points that in relation to just the changes that are happening in education. I mean, from the very earliest phase of education, primary school education, right through in terms of just not really fostering that creative approach or interest in our education system, and then tuition fees and everything else. So it's all really quite depressing, to be honest. Take this off me quick.
I think we're picking up on what we're all feeling at this particular moment in time. There's an anxiety in almost every sphere, and including art education, with so many changes. It's so driven in schools that the maths and science, you have to learn those, and art can be put on the back burner, and also just the way even maths is taught. It isn't like creativity isn't the main thing anymore, and that sort of seems to be coming right through the system. And I think it must be quite a difficult time to be a student, actually, of anything, but certainly an art student at the moment. And the sort of old school art schools as such were such a different place, where there was just senior artists. When I was at Goldsmiths, there were artists, in the next studio to me, because Surrey Docks was so big that we could all paint there together, and we'd be in and out of each other's studios, talk to each other, and there wasn't a sort of hierarchy. Or Bert Owen would come in and say, come talk to my gallery, I really like that painting. Or there was a sort of symbiosis between artists and a sense that we were all in this art school together. And that was incredibly valuable, and gave me a sort of confidence, I suppose, also, that it was a valid thing to be doing, and there was you know, you could go to lectures, but you didn't have to, and it was really what you took it to be, what you wanted it to be, which was really an amazing experience.
Yeah, just picking up on that point. I remember arriving at Goldsmiths and realising that I was totally felt like I was in my element, but at the same time having that feeling of like I've got all this space and access to tutors, but it was very much that you were treated like another artist. So there wasn't as you were saying, there wasn't that hierarchy between student and teacher, basically, or tutor. So that was a kind of a bewildering thing to start with, but also something that you could really, it gave you something to really delve into. It gave you the ability to kind of reinvent yourself and reinvent what you were doing with your work.
I think we're sort of almost wrapping up the sort of discussion. The evening seems to go past very quickly. But before we do, I'm sure the conversation could be widened out. And there's artists here, there's tutors here, there's students, there's others. Has anybody got something to contribute or to ask? Feel free. Emma, I'm just interested. I think Paul said that. Was it you, Alison, about foundation?
Yeah.
Would you like to comment in terms of sort of foundation course teaching?
I suppose I'm quite concerned that universities are taking students straight from A level, and they're missing out. You picked up on that they're missing out on the foundation experience. I don't know what we do about that. I don't know how we tackle that.
I suppose it's finances, is it?
Yeah, I think so.
Students feel that that's an extra year and they could be already getting on.
Yeah, I don't know.
Is it also that there's an incentive for schools to send students straight to university? So there's a kind of point system with progression from school, and for further education, which foundation comes under activism, there's fewer points.
Oh, really? Is that true? Oh dear, that's very depressing.
Yeah, I think that then affects the relationship between.
So they get more sort of points on their.
It's better for them.
Oh, really?
It's better.
Yeah, it's crucial.
Yeah. I mean, it has become quite topical at the moment, hasn't it? The sort of giving students unconditional places. I mean, that was another problem, isn't it? That you don't have that incentive to really sort of do your best on a foundation course to get into the best college. You can kind of get an unconditional offer while you're still at school. Any other comments on any other topic related to the work, hours, or to anybody on the panel? No, you're very quiet. Just to say that Luke and I both teach painting here at Oxford. Just a little sell here for Avada painting courses. And yeah, we teach a contemporary painting course, which is look it up on the website. It's very good. And Alison in London, equally really interesting courses. Great school.
Lovely set of tutors, actually.
Yes, and a really outstanding collection. So selling ESOP now.
And we don't just teach painting as well. We've got David Mack, who's a sculptor, who teaches our postgraduate course. So it's a broad range of people. David Mack. He's I don't know if he's a sculptor. He's known for his coat hanger animals and tire installations. And he was nominated for the Turner Prize actually, 25. I didn't realise that. But he's also an RA. He teaches a postgraduate course, and we're probably going to be doing an art safari with him in South Africa in October. And we've got lots of interesting painting tutors as well. And Bob Matthews, who teaches Royal College of Art, he does a contemporary fine art course on a Friday. So that's multimedia. So you get access to tutors you normally wouldn't have access to unless you did a degree course. You can come and we cap our numbers at 12. And materials are included. So you can do a postgrad year for 2,000.
Oh, now.
2,000 pounds a week. With David Mann.
Yeah, 1,900 for us.
And how often do you get to talk to a tutor?
Well, you're in a group of 12, 1 day a week. So that works out, actually, people say that they get as much tutor time 1 day a week as they do, possibly sometimes even more. And the postgraduate course was previously run by Bob and Roberta Smith. If you heard of him. And so he, maybe I shouldn't quote him actually, but you get a lot of tutor time because he teaches elsewhere.
Question here.
It's the Essential School painting in London. We're in Wood Green now, which is on the Piccadilly line. It's about 4 or 5 stops from King's Cross Station. We were in Bethel Green for 14 years, but we've just moved to Wood Green. So
I've got a question for Paul, actually,
yeah.
related to that. I mean, it's quite interesting, I think, at the moment, the move where something like the ESOP is setting up sort of painting and other it's bringing up alternative art schools. Because I think...
And Turks Banana.
And Turks Banana, and there are others up and down the country sort of setting up artist-to-artist teaching. And I think it's partly because actually what we're beginning to realise is that, this is a question for Paul. I mean, does it make a lot of difference in your when you see young artists that they have a first-class degree? Does that make a lot of difference to you? I mean, how much does a qualification really... Is that an essential part of being an artist?
I think, at the moment, people like myself that run institutions are becoming very aware of the fact that the only artists that we look at are those that are conventionally taught. And I'm not even talking about the Turks model or, they tend to have BAs, MAs in fine art practices. And because there's such a discourse at the moment around the fact that the whole art world is incredibly absolutely unaware and exclusive and isn't engaging with a wider demographic. There's a lot of reflection on the processes by which I will really only look at certain kinds of artists, and that's seen as being a very exclusive, problematic system. So there are lots of initiatives that are emerging at the moment that are very much looking at artists that are not coming through those routes, that are not traditionally trained, quite outsider artists, but there's a real focus around that, I think. So that's another thing that's happening. And there's also big moves towards audience participation, much more participatory models in the making of exhibitions, making work and making shows with audiences, because there's a space for greater relevance to non-conventional, non-engaged audiences around institutions. So I think this Brexit moment that we're in is really requiring us, and it's a very good thing to really question the system, the culture, the learned behaviours of what being in the art world are, because we are all so mired in them. And I sometimes really have to get out of my own way in order to think, how can I talk to someone in Blackbird Leeds about what we do at Modern Art Oxford and what does that look like? And it probably is engaging them with the forms of accessible technologies like making films on iPhones. I mean, look at Charlotte Project, it's just won the Turner Prize, Yes, exactly. But it's a sort of, I think that there is this desire to really reinvent like what the art world is about in order to be relevant. And so I say this to all of us that are curators or artists that, through the systems that are producing culture, they are being seen as being very exclusive of mainstream, the majority of mainstream society. It's only something like 19% of the population that went once, I think, to a museum or art gallery in the last year. And lots of people think that art, I mean, I'm just talking about museums, I'm not even talking about contemporary, modern and contemporary art. They just don't think that it has anything of any relevance to them. It's for wealthy people, it's for middle class people that are quite wealthy and are mostly white and frankly also more male. That's the way that it's seen. So there's a big push about the democratic deficit in society at the moment, and institutions like mine that are publicly funded are under a lot of pressure to have the forms of self-awareness that mean that I shouldn't be looking just at artists that are coming through these routes that are becoming increasingly exclusive, because who can afford to do a fine art degree nowadays?
Do you think those issues are being readdressed now generally? Do you think? I think it's happening. I think there is a great critical wave that is happening at the moment. I people take me to task for our programme, which is absolutely to be expected in my role at the gallery. But I will, I'm very pleased that I think I've been at the gallery for about 5.5 years. We've probably had about 30 shows, maybe 26 or 27 of those have been great artists that are women. And I will get critiqued as a white privileged male, performing inclusivity to maintain my elite privileged position by programming women. And it's like, how do you even argue? I mean, all of who can speak for whom at the moment, and how artists can speak for other people, all of that is really being radically contested, I think, at the moment. And I think the arts are going through, there's so many different crises, I think, that are in education and in the values around culture, and and of course they're all connected into this really peculiar social and political moment that we're in. But I'm conscious that there's
somebody else was going to ask. Comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that we're discussing education, the art world, Instagram. Where is the artist? Where are the artists fitting in on that, I just wish that the artists themselves would take their own future in their own hands and gather more, share more, like it was during the modern art movement, where people were gathering together, artists were gathering together to discuss issues, discuss ideas. And I think where I disagree on the Instagram thing is it's actually a great platform for artists who are not on the spotlight from the art world to share their ideas in an easily communicable way. Because it's not only putting a picture on it, but actually you see a lot of, especially in pottery makers, trying to describe their process, their thought, quite decently on Instagram. So I think I understand your point of view, but I think it's a great platform. Sorry,
Thank
that's
you. I have to agree with you, and I don't know that Juan was necessarily completely dismissing Instagram. I think it was more.
I live vicariously through. You won't hear about this talk in 5 minutes on Instagram. But no, what I think what worries me is the only thing that worries me is like I said, just the fact that it's such a strong influence. It's such a strong influence, and it's very difficult to explain the difference between. Sometimes you go, well, okay, so there's Picasso, and then there's Bob Smith in Australia who does stuff with ink and marbling, and that's different. The two are different, and everything is going through. And I don't know, maybe that's going to generate a new culture. Maybe, but we're at the early stages where I think I think the same happened with photography. Actually, when photography was invented, there was a craze for a while for people were taking pictures of each other jumping. Because it was such an amazing thing to capture stillness, and there's this whole collection of people jumping. So maybe we'll go through that excitement that we can. Everybody can have a voice now, but equally, that means that you let all sorts of things in.
Yeah, but that's the role of education, is to actually educate the students to what is good and what is not good, instead of having them going completely wide with their own ideas. I mean, we're talking about foundation as well versus BA. It's just basically doing a 4-year course instead of a 3
Yeah,
years
no,
course.
I've never really so much thought of teaching what is good and not, because I think for me, and even when we're talking about, should you study here or should you study there, and for me, even where you study creates part of the context where you come from, and that can be sometimes we talk about this idea of embedded academic research, so that you teach there in a sense your ideas are being filtered through being there. In the same way, I'd like to think, this like Black Mountain College or Sparrow House, so it's like a philosophy. And I think what I was trying to say about Instagram is that it's very difficult to hold that sense of what that philosophy is, and it's a very it's almost like it's like a sound that at the moment I just feel drowns everything else that we're saying is kind of drowned to a certain extent by not so much the idea of quality but quantity, the idea of anxiety about getting likes, anxiety about having followers and measuring success in that sense, on that kind of quantitative rather than quality. I mean, like a very good artist, I know John Wilkins, otherwise we know him as Will. I mean, he's got whatever, I don't know, 42 followers, and he's an amazing artist, but and he once said to me, and take this with a pinch of salt, he said, in the end, the only true success that you can have is standing in front of your work. And I think that's something that we're losing, that sense of making the work and being focused about making the work and trying to drown out all the noise and how to measure what that success is, and etc., etc. And I think that is something that is very difficult to hold on to at the moment, that idea of standing in front of the work and being sentient of what it means to be an artist, to have a practice, etc. So I think that's all I mean, really. But I will post the talk later.
I look forward to it.
See, I really like Instagram because for me it's a very democratic space where, like, Mod Oxford has an Instagram account. We can give that over to our volunteers, for a week to run, or we can give it to our graduate artist platform prize winner to run for. It's like a sort of a space that doesn't have all the sort of preciousness around the exhibition spaces, and I like the fact that I'll get lots of direct messages because I'm on Instagram. I get messages from artists saying, follow me or look at my page, and it's really easy, much easier for me just to look at an artist's work in that way than of course the conventional thing to do an artist studio visit. It's really difficult for me to do artist studio visits because it's just a time pressure thing, and of course it's the thing that I enjoy doing more than anything. And you get offered these jobs, you think, I'm going to spend all my day doing artist studio visits and kind of talking about theory with interesting people and wearing Prada, or whatever. And actually you don't do any of that. You spend all your time fundraising, managing your board, and harassing your team, usually within an inch of its life. And and sort of so I mean there are all of these things. So so I actually find it really useful to be able to look at an artist's practice, just glance at it, because to show support for it, to follow an artist on Instagram. And I know that or like tonight, I will Instagram this, and I will say, oh, congratulations, great talk, blah 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 blah. And these things have a sort of an influence, bizarrely, that people will then say, oh, they'll go, they might have a look at that, they might actually follow, me again, or they might actually come to some of my. So we're in this odd moment, I think, and I think artists have got so few outlets to be influential, to get to raise their visibility. They are really the most important thing in the art system, and then the thing that's least empowered. I think that the more tools, like having a website, having clear artist statements, having good images, being on Instagram, marketing yourself, networking, all those things that artists hate doing. But The world is changing. You know, we are in all of these things are changing. All of these experiential sites. You know, the artists aren't the privileged experiential site in society anymore. People are blogging. They're out there, trend, consumer fashion orienting. I mean, it's like a slightly depressing situation. But artists are not the only experiential space in society that is privileged anymore in the way that it has been historically. There are other people that are emoting about splitting up with their boyfriend or failing their driving test on YouTube, you know, that have got thousands of followers. And you're like, why? You know, or endless selfies. I mean, you know, it's you know, it's like
the
where'd you
egg
go
was
with
the
that?
most Instagram.
Yeah.
I think it was an egg, just a picture of an ordinary egg that was the most Instagram image. I don't know what that means.
Yeah.
I just want to agree with you actually, and I think it's really liberated artists. When I remember first showing in the 80s, and the dealers would rub your name off the back of your work and your address and your phone number because they wanted to be the sole conduit through which people found you. It was before the internet, and so you were quite vulnerable in a sense to the dealers, and if they weren't paying a retainer, which that's all gone now, you know, how are you supposed to survive and get yourself out there? So I think it's incredibly, but I also appreciate your point. I think it's really well put, and I just want to add to that a quote from Louise Bourgeois, who said, "Art is its own reward." So, I can imagine students getting really carried away with the number of likes, and apparently it just gives you a dopamine hit when you get a like. So it's actually physically, physically addictive. It's the same pathways as cocaine and fat and sugar. And the person who invented likes on Facebook says he wishes he never invented it and doesn't let his kids on social media. So there is, but yes, anyway. That. Well, can I? Are you wanting to wrap up? Can I say one more thing?
Is it? How are we doing for time?
About 5 minutes.
All right. Can I just say one thing? It's unrelated, but it's just actually because we've just been given funding for 3 scholarships for young people, 21 to 30. So if anybody wants to apply to do a course with us and an exhibition at the end in July, 21 to 30, 1 day a week. Funding for free scholarship. Scholarships. Yeah, I know.
You really did it.
That's very just.
The thing is, if you're a young person, now I went to art school and it was free. And now our students are coming out doing a big.
It was a joke. It was a joke.
I've just got an Instagram story which I think is really actually very positive, and just to just to put it in balance, and that is really just that I think 3 just very well because I happen to work next door to their ceramic studio, and they are straight out of art school. They've set themselves up with a pottery practice, illustration, and they're really quite unusual and talented, all of them. And they have gone from coming straight out of art school to establishing themselves across the world. They're exhibiting in Japan. They've got orders from Met. They've got, they can't make enough of their work, and that is entirely through Instagram. And it's empowering, I think, particularly women, and particularly young women coming out of art school, who have it's actually works in so many different ways. I mean, it works as a platform for the world to see your work, and then it also works for you to see other people's work. So, I mean, I can see it's a problem in a particular environment where you like your students to see more restricted things, but it does also have a very positive effect, I think, financially on a generation of artists being able to completely bypass the gallery system, or and be able to sell directly to people, or get galleries interested in their work as well. But they can survive, and I think anybody who can survive by making their own work, that's to be applauded. And if Instagram has helped with that, then I think that's a good thing. Any other questions or comments from the audience? Because I think we'll sort of wrap it up here, and if you've got a couple more minutes and want to look round again or talk to either of us about the work, we're around for a few minutes. I'm absolutely starving, so not for very long. But yeah, just a big thank you to the panel for joining us, much appreciated, and also to the audience. Thank you.